Welcome back to this Lightroom Quickstart Bootcamp I've got going on. This is our 5th video and the last in our first chapter of what we're looking at with getting started in all things Lightroom. And today, it's all about going for the preferences, understanding what they are, how they control Lightroom, and what we can do to customize Lightroom for our own desires and what we want to do and how it will work for us. Let's start right now. All right, when we're here in Lightroom, what we're looking at is certainly just right now, just a standard view of the images. And we've already seen, how I categorize things and things like that. But how do we get things, customized? Here we go. I say Latitude Photography Podcast up here in the corner. We've got an option here where we can then click on this item, do a face detection, address lookup. These are things that are actually going to be set in the preferences, but that's just, you click on that and you're like, well, why didn't that bring up something about this, whatever this says? So to change this item, what you do is you right click on it and then you're able to, you can personalize it. You can just do the Lightroom Classic idea there. I certainly, of course, like it personalized. And then I can, of course, edit this identity plate. And when we edit the identity plate, what we're looking at is selecting fonts, selecting a graphic that might go in there. You could come up with lots of different things, again, with your font, whatever it is that you're going to be typing in there. And so you literally just select it and you can start typing in whatever you want. Of course, I will continue to correctly spell those items. And then you have certainly some other items here with some font choices for what these will look like. And that is, of course, your modules over here. So there's a quick idea there on the identity plate editor. Let's go ahead and hit OK. And then we're going to jump into Lightroom Classic, and then we're going to go to Preferences and take a look at the rest of these preferences. Now, one thing I really want to get across, I'm going to look at many of these preferences, but not all of them. There are a boatload of preferences to be thinking about, and I just want to show the ones that are most important for those of us that are just getting started right out of the bat with Lightroom. We want to make sure we understand how a few things work and how these things behave, and if we are trying to look at everything, I think we're going to get a little bit overwhelmed. So I'm going to truncate it just a little bit, and I will skip a few things in this video. Certainly to start us off, we're going to look at the general here. You've got various language items that we can change it to, and that's probably nice if you have a preference for changing that one way or another. Whether or not you want to show that splash screen at startup, it has a little graphic. It tells you all sorts of things about Lightroom. I say, why not? It kind of gives me an idea. It tells me that it's loading, but it's not something that gets in my way really. So I say, sure, why not? Now this I really like. When starting up, use this catalog, the most recent catalog, or I can choose a specific catalog. I usually like to have most recent catalog because if I'm giving an example in class or something like that, and I've got something going on for a few days, and maybe I don't get into my personal catalog right away, for 3 or 4 days at a time or something like that, then I'm able to always have it default to that one I was just most recently in. Now, of course, if it opens up the wrong one, I just go and open up a different one. It's no big deal, and it changes to that catalog. But I like this one just because of the way I work. 90% of the time or more, I'm in my standard catalog anyway. But if I do need a jump, it's usually a couple days worth of lessons that I'm doing in that other catalog. All right, some import options. Show import dialog when memory card is inserted. Do you want to do that or not? That's a default behavior. I like to do that. I plug it in. Lightroom just responds and it gives it to me. I like that. Select the current/previous import collection during import. Now we've seen that before, and what I want to take a look at, I'm going to try and show that to you here. You see this previous import item over here in the catalog here where it says previous import. So basically what it's doing is it's going to change our selection. So if we were out of this and we imported, it would change our selection to this item here, this preview here that we have that's called previous import. You can see this previous import is some images that I imported from a time I went up to northern Idaho for some snowshoeing, a lot of reject images, but still it tracks what those previous import items are. And so that's the default view when you are done importing those images. Again, that's another thing I like to do, so I go ahead and keep it on. Ignore camera-generated folder names when naming folders. If I were to use camera-generated folders, I would absolutely have this checked, but I don't, and so I don't care. I just bring it in image by image, and I grab all images regardless of what folder they're in. So yeah, this isn't an issue for me, so I don't worry about it. Treat JPEG files next to RAW files as separate photos. Now, this is something I must admit I have totally not gotten into the details of this practice, i.e., why would I deselect this to where Lightroom will view or treat those images, those JPEG images. This is if you were to shoot RAW plus JPEG in your camera. And so do you want Lightroom to treat them as the same photo effectively or as two separate photos? Since they're literally two separate photos, two separate files, I go ahead and treat them as two separate files. But that's another thing. I very rarely shoot RAW plus JPEG. So this is something where, since I'm always shooting in the RAW format, I've never really viewed this as an issue. But for those times where I do add the JPEG, I'm saying I want that treated separately because I'm usually doing it as a test. I'm usually doing it as some kind of reason where I want to make sure I can analyze the differences of what's going on, what's happening, whatever the case is. And so I'm not that concerned about it being treated as a separate file. The biggest thing I can think of here for why this is a big issue is if you were to rename your files, well, the RAW file and the JPEG version of that file are going to be then named two different things, where if you were to treat them as the same file, they would then be named as the same thing. And so that would be something, again, I've not tested it, I've not looked at that. It's just something that it makes sense as to how that's how it would behave, but I've not done it, and it's not a common practice for myself. Replace embedded previews with standard previews during idle time. I say, sure, go ahead and do that. What's the deal here? Well, every single RAW file will have an embedded preview built in, an embedded preview in there. And what I like to do is have my Lightroom generated standard previews come in and always be the default. So if it can do some work in the background or whatever the case is, and it can replace that item, sure, let's go ahead and do that is my thinking. As far as completion sounds, when it does these things, I like to change it to no sound because every time something is done and it gives me a little jingle or whatever, that would just annoy me. So I'm gonna say no on that. All right, so on these presets over here, what do we do with that? And you can override global settings for a specific camera. So that's kind of nice too. It might be the case where because I shoot two different cameras, a Sony and a Canon, I might want to treat those two separately and have different defaults, different presets going for each camera. And I can see that making a lot of sense. Again, that's not something that I have done here. You can just see I'm using the Adobe default. Click on this button to learn more about the RAW defaults. This is something where if I were into probably lots of commercial shoots and I had lots of different varieties of things going on, then I could see myself totally getting into this and saying, when I shoot this genre of image, I want to do that. When I'm shooting for this client, I want to do that. I just haven't really seen value in trying to mess with this when it comes to my travel and landscape images. So I just leave it at the Adobe defaults. And I do have a preset. I do actually, you saw earlier, I believe you saw that happen when I have this item, BB Landscape Color. That is something I do apply to all my images, but that's regardless of camera. That's regardless of situation because it's all about settings that I want applied to each and every image. When it comes to external editing, this is probably, especially if you're going to be getting into Photoshop, this is huge. All right, so what type of file format are you going to be doing? Are you going to have it translated to a TIFF image, a PSD image? I like TIFF because it allows me to have a bigger file as it relates to the file size. I can go up to 4 gigabytes in size rather than just the 2 that the PSD is limited to. My color space, the default for Lightroom color space is ProPhoto, and I say let's go ahead and bring that into Photoshop as well. When I get into Photoshop, if I need to change it, I'll change it. But by default, I love ProPhoto color space. It gives me the biggest, it's huge as a color space, and it gives me the most opportunity to shift colors around, to deal with colors, to make sure I have the most color available in my images whatsoever. ProPhoto is it. Certainly when I go to printing, and if you were to take a look at my printing course I have on my website, you're going to understand and have my arguments there for when I change that and why I change it. Lots of details go into that discussion. But since the default in Lightroom is ProPhoto, I want the same idea when I go to Photoshop. And then the bit depth on 16 versus 8 bits. I love the 16-bit depth difference there versus the 8 bits because it's not that I have different starting points of where my darks and my brights are, because that's a given with my camera. That is set by the camera. I don't have any other control over that natively anyway. Now, if I were to do some kind of HDR processing in Photoshop, that changes things, but that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about what's set right there in the camera. And are you going to be, 14-bit in camera, 12-bit in camera? That's what most of our cameras are. When we work with Photoshop, though, it works in either 8-bit or the 16-bit. So you have 16.7 million colors in the 8-bit, and you have billions of colors available in the 16-bit. What really that is, it's all about the tiniest little increments between those little, you have 0, you have 255. Those are still the same numbers, really. Between the 8-bit and 16-bit, it's just now you have smaller steps to go in between those two items. And so that's where I like to have those smaller steps. You get better nuanced detail, less of a chance of that banding happening in the sky. So if you have a pure blue sky with subtle color gradations and you want that color to be perfect, then 16-bit is going to be a little more easily achievable with that, especially when you're printing, than the 8-bit. Now, certainly when you're going 8-bit, you have to do that for going on the web and things like that. But when you're going for ultimate quality, for original images and the things like that, 16 bits is where it's at. On the resolution, I love 240 because this is perfect whether or not I'm going to print on an Epson printer or a Canon printer. Those numbers just happen to fit really well with the resolution of those printers. Now, if you were to always be on the Canon like I have sitting here, I might go ahead and change this to 300 or something like that. But the default of 240, resolution is just not important when you're doing anything other than printing. When it comes to printing, resolution is hugely important. It's probably the biggest thing you ever want to think about. Well, besides good color and good content and all that other good stuff. But on a technical scale, resolution is important. It's huge when you print. It means virtually nothing when you are going for online stuff or any other digital representation of your image, like on your phone or anything like that. So with resolution, 240 is good. I like to leave that. That is a default that they have, and I like to leave that there. If you have an additional external editor, you can see you've got an option here. And that's where, for me, I really don't need that. I pretty much just am in Photoshop. But you can see I do have some other ones that I've been testing out on one, Effects Develop. Here's Luminar. If I need that, if you need that, certainly set that up for yourself. But again, for me, I just go elsewhere, or Photoshop. If I'm needing to do something outside of Lightroom, I'm definitely in Photoshop. All right, a few items on the file handling. If we were to do the DNG creation, as we were importing images, I talked through that and how I like to copy it in as the standard camera raw from the manufacturer. But if you were to do the DNG, how is it going to treat that? And what kind of JPEG preview is it going to give you there? Let's move over here a little bit to the interface. If you may have been wondering, how did I get these little things here? See where it says publish services, and then I have this hat at the end here. These are the end marks on the panels. What are we going to look at there? And so what I did was I created a black and white version of my hat logo, and I saved it out as a transparency, some transparency in the PSD file. I then brought that in and put it right here at the end so I could have an extra branding element here in Lightroom that goes with me everywhere I go. If I were to show this on screen somewhere, there's my hat. It's just about branding. There's how you do it. It's right here in this interface, panels, end marks. Now, if we were to change that to small flourish, you can see what that looks like. Of course, for me, I'm a fan of the hat, so I'm going to keep it there. All right, on your lights out, this is something that basically you hit the L key. And so we can see the screen color goes black. We have these other items or a dim level of 80%. Let's go ahead and test that out and see exactly what we're talking about. So I'm back here just in regular Lightroom. I hit the L key and you can see the lights out has gone, and really just the images are what I can see. And then I've got a very dim all the way around everything else. If I hit L again, totally takes it out in complete blackout. Hit it one more time, the L key, and it comes back to life. So we can change that to a different default value for our dim level, and then we can change it like if we were to go white. What would we do here? Well, let's take a look. If I hit L, it brightens up like mad, right? And there we have it completely white out, and there you have it like that. So the black is the default, and all right, with our background color, the darker gray, the dark gray, these different colors. Now again, if I were to close this out, it should make some changes there, and I'll go back into here and I'll pull up some Chile images. All right, so here you see how that turned black. So let's go back and do this where it's darker gray again. And then on the secondary window, since I'm not using the secondary monitor, see this little extra icon in the lower left-hand corner? That's the secondary monitor. So yeah, I'm not using that. I'll go ahead and go back to black on that. Not a big deal. This next item on the film strip, that's all these images down here. I do like to be able to show these badges. And what these things are these little things across the bottom. They're really tiny, but they tell you some good information. And so when we look at that, let me mouse over one of these, and we can take a look, and it says, okay, photo has keywords. All right, and this next one, the plus minus, photo has develop adjustments. And this next one, photo is in a collection. So it has these different little things that can give us a little cue as to what is going on with that image. It's got some keywords, it's got some develop settings, and it's just nice to be able to see that at a quick glance. And of course, there's other items here, the ratings and picks. That's where these little dots down here are going to be. That's the ratings. The flags are talking about the picks, whether or not it's going to show that to us. Show photos in Navigator on mouse over. So that is when we have this Navigator item up, and you'll notice when I take my cursor and I just mouse over, it changes the photo that's in that Navigator. So that's right there, right in your preferences. Okay, let's finish this up with a little bit on performance, and I think I'll talk a little bit about Lightroom Sync as well, and then we'll be good to go. All right, so for the camera raw, use graphics processor, use the GPU for display, and also I can use the GPU for image processing, process versions 5 and higher. That's the raw process version of 5 and higher. So I do like to definitely have it for display, but I've noticed on my machine, I've got a 2019 MacBook Pro with the i9 processor, and I've noticed that it has a little bit of a slight issue, maybe I'll say, when I use the GPU for image processing. And what I mean by a slight issue is it gets a little hot, and maybe with this newer version of Lightroom, because they just released a new version of Lightroom before I did this video, we might have some benefits here where I could turn this on and everything would be good. But I've not tested it, so I'm just going to go ahead and leave it alone. If you have a GPU, I definitely say at least do it for display. And then you might recognize a little bit of processing enhancement if you go ahead and do the GPU for image processing, because it'll use the CPU and the GPU, and you just might get a little extra juice out of it. So that could be nice. So your raw cache settings. So these are going to be just some data that Lightroom needs to do its own thing. And so I do have this on my local drive. You'll recall from before, I save everything on an external drive. Well, Okay, here's one thing where that's the exception to the rule. And whatever is done in this caches, I will allow it to be on my local drive. It is a little bit faster, of course, than the external drive. And so that's where it's a little bit nicer to go ahead and have those caches on the local drive. Okay, this next item here, the Lightroom sync, you can see here it's attached to my Adobe ID. And what this is all about is what subset of photos, what collection of photos do you want to synchronize with Lightroom CC? So this is Lightroom Classic. You can upload or otherwise synchronize these items to Lightroom CC, so you have it in both areas. I have played around with this a little bit. This is something I've decided Lightroom CC I'm not a fan of, so I pretty much don't do this at all anymore. And I should probably go ahead and click this item that says delete all synced data, because I just don't do it and I don't really care about that. It's not something for me, so I'm not really worried about it at all. Well, that wraps it up for us with this look at the Lightroom preferences, which helps us to understand how the software works, how we can at least change a few things at least, and what we can do to make it work better for us. Happy shooting!